Our muscles, when they shiver, they create heat. That's shivering-induced thermogenesis. When you have, as a baby, especially an infant, has a lot of brown fat, that brown fat is keeping them sufficiently warm that there's no shivering required. But of course, as they start to get a little older, the brown fat starts to diminish. And sure enough, by the time we become even kids and aging up towards adulthood, there's a shift happening. And relatively less of our fat is brown fat, and more of our fat is the storage white adipose tissue.
As we develop, relatively less of our fat is brown fat. More is white or storage adipose tissue.
We have brown fat tissue, and it is relevant. It is more active in some people. It can be induced to be more active in some people. Regardless, if you have more of it and it's more active, you're going to be in a good place metabolically speaking. So brown adipose tissue is unique because in fact, it looks brown because it is enriched, with other things, with mitochondria. And as you know, mitochondria is the site of oxidation of nutrients, glucose or lipids. What the mitochondria are doing in brown adipose tissue, though, is unique. But all mitochondria have a capacity to do two types of things. And so on one hand, the mitochondria will pull in glucose, and it will only use as much glucose as it needs for the work that the cell is requiring the energy for. Does that make sense? The cell has a certain need for energy, and then it will take in only as much nutrient, glucose in this case, in the particular case of the brown adipocyte. It'll pull in only as much glucose into the mitochondria as it needs for the work to get done. Mitochondria also have the ability to pull in glucose and use it to produce nothing but heat. And it will just continue to produce heat. And so it's like you just keep throwing logs onto the fire. What is producing this heat is something called the uncoupling protein, or UCP1. All mitochondria have, to some degree, this protein.
Mitochondria also have the ability to pull in glucose and use it only to produce heat. The UCPI, or the uncoupling protein, is producing this heat.
If uncoupling protein has its way, it's starting to produce a lot of heat from the mitochondria. But as you can see, if we're wanting the fire to get bigger and bigger and bigger, the fuel is glucose, so our glucose starts to come down. In a human, if glucose starts to come down, that of course is going to affect insulin. And what happens to insulin? Well, of course it starts to come down. We have less need to increase insulin to try to bring it out of the blood. The mitochondria are already doing it. And this overall series of events, more uncoupling protein in mitochondria, resulting in this subtle increase in heat, sometimes imperceptible, mind you, in the body, but this results in a reduction in blood glucose because we have a sink, we have a place to dump the glucose, a reduction in insulin, and overall creating a very metabolically favorable milieu. The body is becoming less resistant to obesity and more resistant to diabetes and conditions of insulin resistance. So back to the liver. The liver is a site of tremendous flux, converting nutrients into other nutrients. And at the heart of this is the molecule acetyl-CoA. And again, you've already seen this if you hadn't seen it before. Acetyl-CoA is at the branch point of many, many nutrients. Nutrients turning into acetyl-CoA or acetyl-CoA turning into nutrients. All of them, amino acids, glucose, fatty acids. In the case of what the liver is going to do with acetyl-CoA, liver is going to dictate that in a large way. There are other hormones that come into play, but insulin stands, again, above the rest. Now, as a reminder, acetyl-CoA is a metabolite of the breakdown of both fats and glucose. So just keep that in mind. If insulin is high, it wants to turn acetyl-CoA into lipid. So whatever source the acetyl-CoA was, or wherever we got that from, if insulin is up, it's activating an overall series of events that is pushing acetyl-CoA into lipogenesis, creating new fats from the liver. If, in contrast, insulin is low, then we have a very different outcome. And in this case, we have this unique production of ketones.
Acetyl-CoA is a metabolite, the end product of metabolism, of lipid and glucose. If insulin is high, it turns acetyl-CoA into lipid or body fat. If insulin is low, it turns acetyl-CoA into ketones.
Insulin is a potent inhibitor of ketogenesis. And let me be clear, this is a pathway that is never resistant. You can have the most profoundly insulin-resistant individual on the planet. Insulin will still act in this pathway and inhibit ketogenesis. But in this case, I'm saying insulin is low. In an insulin-sensitive individual, insulin's low. Ketogenesis is happening. So we start producing ketones.
Shivering-induced thermogenesis. Babies have enough brown fat to keep warm, so no shivering. As we develop, relatively less of our fat is brown fat. More is white or storage adipose tissue. If you have more brown fat, says Dr. Bikman, or you can induce more brown fat and it is active, you will be in a good place metabolically. Brown fat has more mitochondria, which is the site of oxidation of glucose, blood sugar, or lipids, fat. Mitochondria will only pull in enough glucose to burn for the work required by the cell. Mitochondria also have the ability to pull in glucose and use it only to produce heat. The UCPI, or the uncoupling protein, is producing this heat. As the UCPI produces heat, glucose comes down. This reduces the need for insulin, so it comes down too. This creates metabolic health. Acetyl-CoA in the liver, the branch point of many nutrients. Nutrients turning into acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA turning into nutrients like amino acids, glucose, and fatty acids. The liver dictates this, and insulin is its main hormone. Acetyl-CoA is a metabolite, the end product of metabolism, of lipid and glucose. If insulin is high, it turns acetyl-CoA into lipid or body fat. If insulin is low, it turns acetyl-CoA into ketones. Insulin is a potent inhibitor of ketogenesis. This pathway is never resistant. Insulin will always inhibit ketogenesis. But when insulin is low, ketogenesis is happening and we produce ketones.